All right, everybody, welcome to the Talent Insights podcast, special edition, Hirewell Data Insights, hiring trends for Q1 2024, where we really talk about what happened in Q4 2023 and all of last year, really. Brought to you by Hirewell and Rainmakers. Once again, joined by our fearless leader, CEO, Matt Massucci.
Hey James, happy not so new year. How you doing?
Doing good. It's actually my second podcast of the day, so I'm warmed up. So yeah, we do these once a quarter. We wanted to get back to it, and this one we want to recap kind of on what happened last year, especially compared to kind of the previous year and previous quarter, and have some insights in terms of like where things might be headed. I'm not a big predictions guy, but we can look at pipeline and some forward-looking things and try to get an idea. But Matt, why don't you give us a kind of how are things been looking? Why don't you give us a quick overview of the past year?
Yeah, it was an interesting one. I've been doing this a really long time. I know you've done it for a good amount of time, but I do have you beat there. And it's definitely a year like we have not seen before. Going into 23, we knew there would be some challenges. It was definitely a little bit more challenging than expected. Interestingly enough, it kind of progressively slowed down as the year went on. And I think if anybody's religiously watching these things and saw like each quarter, I think I called it bottom every quarter, and was not correct because it kind of softened as the year went on. So and again, I think that there were some of it was seasonal, right? Like our summer was slow, the holidays were slow, and it just kind of accentuated sort of everything that's happening. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah. So hiring volume total year to year down roughly 25%.
Yeah, and that was kind of across the board. Some areas were up, some were down. We'll kind of get to that, but kind of across the board, the volume was down, and we'll get to those numbers. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of just right around 25% the volume we saw year over year.
Yeah. I'll talk about so one thing, retainers is one thing I can mention. So we look at retained business as a measure of no bullshit, we actually need you business. So companies that actually need to get something done quickly. We've pushed to get all of our business retained. Obviously, in soft markets, you have to take things that aren't necessarily ideal, but that actually increased from Q3 to Q4. So from like 73% to 80% of our business kind of went that route, which is a good sign. There were more companies that seriously needed to hire and make concerted hiring efforts and make things happen in a specific time frame, which is a good thing to see.
Yeah, I think the context there is, I mean, anybody in recruiting or TA knows it's been a tough year. Companies have cut deep. They paused a lot sort of early in the year. They gutted their internal TA teams, and so I think it got to the point where if they were kind of going on their own, they started to struggle, and I think just the sheer volume of sort of handling it and doing it, like it's still hard to find good people. I know we're going to get into the overall market trends. I mean, unemployment is still low, and so companies just I think they recognize and they need help and they need to call on some experts, and so that's it was a positive trend from Q4.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think kind of into the next topic, the other trend we saw, our interim talent solutions. So just as a reminder, we do it kind of across all of our functional areas, but really the biggest three are interim HR in recruiting talent, interim tech talent, and then interim kind of digital creative marketing talent. And so that was flat year over year. And I think that was sort of an interesting thing. I mean, it's not that it was easy there, but it was a bit more resilient kind of than other parts. And there was definitely a lot of churn. I think we had a lot of projects end, but then a lot start kind of as the year went on, and that's been sort of a pretty strong highlight. We've even seen a dip into January where usually there's a attrition of projects ending at year end. We had a lot more carry into Q.
Yeah. And that's the maybe the first thing that has me kind of hopeful about the next year, because when we're talking about contractors, freelancers, payrolling, various people on temporary projects. It was the exact same in a down year versus a year that was actually pretty good. So, when the total deal volume we have or total volume of like, placements we make is down, 25%, but the actual number of like people out there on contract engagements is the same. That's typically what comes back first when things kind of come back. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the fact that, we've kind of been able to maintain that was one of the highlights of the year, I guess.
Yeah, for sure, and not to spoil some of our predictions or trends we're seeing in 2024, but yeah, I think that is hopefully a sign of where the world's going. Um, I think the other bright spot was an interesting, our sales hiring across the organization. So year over year, it was down a couple percent, I think roughly 3% from from 22 to 23. But that's where we saw the biggest trend in Q4. And our sales hiring practice is really, I think they're up 32% from Q3 to Q4, which is the only practice we had that actually grew going into, kind of through Q4.
Yeah, it's a huge pivot for us. Tech and SaaS sales hiring back in the day was like the only thing we did like in the sales space. I would not say the only, but that was like 99%. Now it's still a chunk, but that's come back. But we've been more well-rounded and kind of working in sales kind of in all areas. So that kind of kept us going through it. But then kind of seeing the tech and SaaS, which as we all know is kind of a foundation, like the fundamental part of what so many recruiting firms are based on, whether or not they actually work in tech positions or not. you know, it gives me also hope too that when you see tech firms hiring salespeople again, people are going to grow. People are going to have to build out things further. So
Yeah, and with that, we did the acquisition of a collective search or the collective, bringing over Tom and Jen. And, they're based in the West Coast, heavily, kind of VC, Series B, Series C, backed organizations, and they've really seen a nice uptick as well. So that was exciting to see.
yeah,
And then, the kind of the last sort of interesting one, our F&A practice actually grew, by 20% year over year, which was a very exciting thing to see. And, I knew it was positive, but it was still even better than I expected. It is our smallest practice area, but it sort of speaks to the challenge of finding accountants. And, no matter what, you need people to keep the books. You need people to, kind of run the numbers. So it's something that, it's going to have less of the highs and less of the lows.
yeah. Do we want to talk about the other areas, or we just want to let that go by the wayside?
Obviously we do other things. We do tech, we do HR, we do marketing, and all we're down. I mean, our HR practice was interesting. I mean, that was a pretty heavy shift to that interim HR, whether it be providing interim recruiters, providing interim HR people. We've even dipped our toes in doing HR advisory work for companies that oftentimes don't have the necessary resources internally, and it's something we've been able to provide for clients, which has been exciting. So that's been good, but and then tech and marketing, that was the softest, and I think that the simple reason there is that business is heavily influenced by kind of early mid-staged tech companies, and that's the areas that was hit the hardest. And again, our group there has done a nice job pivoting to kind of more traditional industries. But the fact is, when you have kind of a huge subset of the market, I think I don't have the exact numbers, I might pull it at some point in time, but we just saw a huge number of clients just stop hiring kind of for the full year, and I mean, it's a challenge, but I think it's been nice to see sort of the team, while it's been hard. I mean, they've been resilient and they've been able to kind of leverage relationships and networks to kind of expand into new areas, and then we it's one area that we've seen some positive.
Yeah. Two more things I want to hit on before we kind of call this one off. So trends, what we're doing, what we're focusing on, just so everyone's aware. Then also we want to kind of highlight, kind of macro level, what's happening like in the job market. So, but trends, what's our focus? What do you think people need to know about us and kind of how we're attacking this market?
I would love to say we had some playbook that was different than everybody else, but it sort of speaks to where we've seen activity from our clients. I mean, it's investing in sales and investing in growth. Don't need to tell you, obviously, being our chief growth officer, but we grew to being a pretty 110 plus person organization without really much of a dedicated sales force. But as we kind of move into more complex solutions, we recognize the concept of just doing having our kind of recruiters drive business is it's been extremely useful. We'll continue to be that way, but investing in growth and hiring people to do that is a huge focus. So I'll let you kind of talk about some of the details there.
Yeah, one thing, and I'm gonna throw us off our notes here because I had this like somewhere else there. We've seen a pretty big resurgence ourselves in terms of our pipeline. So I don't like to brag about pipelines because, as you all know, like in terms of it comes real, but Q4 over Q3, we saw about a 35% increase the amount of like things we have going on, which is huge. If that pays off, I'm going to be super happy about it. But not to turn this into a LinkedIn commentary on how to do sales. You can, everyone's well aware that blasting emails and LinkedIn messages just annoys the shit out of everyone. It's not really going to work. I think, as you mentioned to me previously, just the amount of AI-based solutions, which just helps people pump out spam faster, is not the way to get it done. But the way we've been able to build our pipeline It's heavily about personal networks, people who know people, events, being able to map previous relationships, reconnecting with old contacts, teaching non-sales people, the people in the organization aren't really tasked with this, how to maximize relationships, stuff that's second nature to salespeople, but not everyone else. Just making sure that they kind of understand like how to just get the most out of every single call. So it's been productive, very much kind of going back to old school, making sure you're kind of like leveraging and actually getting to know people and meeting people in person, that type of stuff. It's been huge, and the people that we brought on board, very much come from that kind of mindset as opposed to just trying to do LinkedIn based gimmicky sales tricks. So
Yeah, sorry, I had a little technical difficulty with my camera there, but I'm back. And yeah, no, and I think one of the things you touched on that I think is it's kind of going back to the basics, but I know something you've done a lot for us is really just investing in the training and the L&D component, because for those of us who have done this a long time, a lot of this comes second nature. But if you haven't, or you're not in an office working around people who do these things and can teach on the fly, you have to work hard to kind of to do these things. But it's great career advice for anybody, whatever industry you're in. I mean, it's layoffs are out there, they're going to happen, and the best way to make yourself sort of indispensable as an organization is be able to continually drive revenue, drive process, and kind of make the organization successful at all costs. And then I think the other thing that we talked a lot about the trend in interim talent, and I don't think that's going to change. As you summed it up pretty well. Like, this can be called a million different things. It can be called temps, it can be called gig workers, freelancers. It can be more kind of solution-based work. And if you think about what we do, we're a talent solutions provider that can be search, but then we've talked about our on-demand recruiting practice, but the concept is, how do we provide embedded recruiters to our clients to help them, whether it be on a project or sort of indefinitely, or lift out the whole hiring function. We've done it for years, but it's something that we're starting to see companies really investigate more, because they've cut and now they recognize, hey, what we need a solution for this, and it's got to be somewhere in between, hiring a huge team to do this or paying exorbitant fees for everything. And so that's something we see a bunch of. And again, it's those 3 areas I talked about are going to be the biggest, whether it's providing interim technical talent, interim HR, or recruiters, or as well as the interim kind of marketing creative. Those have been things we've always seen and done, but I see that being kind of a huge trend in 2024.
yeah, let's go into kind of general broad market stuff. I pulled some data from the Jolt reports and some other things we've seen out there. What's your take? What do you think's happening right now?
I am not a predictions guy like yourself. I do think, I think 2024 is going to be interesting. I think I almost, in some ways, I think it may be kind of an opposite of what 2023 was, where things slowly got a little bit worse. I think it's going to be the opposite. I think it's going to slowly get a little bit better. But I think it's going to be hard. I think there's going to be more and more announcements of things happening. Like you and Jeff, when you've done your content, you talk about the haves and have-nots. But I think the fact is that the gap there is going to get wider. Look at these big companies that are doing some layoffs, but showing record profits, the big tech companies. And so there's going to be a lot there. I think a lot of these companies have been reliant on zero interest rate dollars, and those are drying up. They're not coming back, so it's going to be painful. I think you're going to see some interesting things play out, where just high profile things go away, or to do some major cuts or fire sales to kind of keep the lights on. So I think there's some challenges there, and and cash is going to be king. So we're constantly seeing companies trying to push out payment terms and doing different things, and I get it. I mean, that's just the world we're in. But money's expensive. When it was free, who cares if they take an extra 30 days to pay? But when that cost of capital is 5, 8, 12%, it can get scary. So and again, I think it will result in more companies shut their doors. I mean, there was 2023 was probably the biggest year in 10, 12 years. From S&P Global Intelligence, I think almost 600 companies went bankrupt in the year, which was the highest since like 2011.
Yeah. And that's the thing, as because I was reading about this, and a lot of it's the zombie company concept, like we had 3 or 4 years of a lot of companies being completely propped up with, government loans, PPP loans and whatnot. And it didn't force people to make decisions. And a lot of companies were completely reliant on it, couldn't like operate a business otherwise. And it kicked the can down the road for a lot of places. And a lot of that just ended up coming to a hilt in 2023 when they weren't able to make it anymore. So, it's just, inefficiencies can only be propped up by government bailouts for so long. And again, I'm not criticizing anyone who took PPP loans or anyone who received, their stimmy checks back in 2020, but it just kind of the reality hits when all of a sudden, like you have to kind of find a way to make things work without it. So I want to also get into the JOLTS, so the actual job reports and whatnot. December 2023 actually wasn't that exciting. So non-farm payrolls, this was last Friday it came out, so early January, about the previous month, increased to 216,000, which exceeded Wall Street expectations by a little bit, but it was like, again, nothing crazy. There's one, I think, key thing we want to talk about with this, about the government and healthcare breakdown of this. So if you want to, this is your stump point that I don't want to take
Yeah,
away from
yeah.
this. So
I think I mean, for a while, like, we talk about the resiliency of the job market, but, then you can kind of peel back the layers a little bit. And I wish I had a little bit more time. I would have pulled it for the full year. Maybe we'll push that out in a couple weeks. But just for December, you talk about 216,000 new jobs, but almost half of those were in healthcare and in government. And it's not sustainable, right? These are things that government is purely just a cost center, and then healthcare is basically as well. They're not adding to GDP, they're not adding to growth. Whether it be the government cost, which obviously tacked onto the deficit, but then healthcare is even scarier because like that is some of the entitlements that are just continuing to grow. And again, it's whatever, not to make it political, but I think it's going to become a little scary if those are the jobs that we're relying on growing because they're not really adding to our.
yeah, looking at the sectors that we care about, like professional and business services, which is our sweet spot for what we do as a firm, but very little change. It was like 13 increase of 13,000. But if you actually break that down, kind of the trends further, the professional, scientific, and technical services trended upward at 25,000. That was the industry average of for the past year, 2023, was 22,000 jobs. So that's professional, scientific, technical services, 22,000 jobs a month increase, but that's half of what it was in 2022. So while jobs came back, it wasn't coming back or growing at any kind of rate, kind of in our circles, which I think is really what kind of causes a lot of the issues that we're seeing as recruiters in those spaces. And one thing I want to throw out there too, kind of neither here nor there, but temporary help services continued a downward trend. So I think that peaked in March 2022, but about minus 33,000. But anyways, unemployment rate unchanged at 3.7%. Unemployed persons unchanged at 6.3 million. Labor force participation rate, which is my least favorite thing to talk about, 62.5%. Highest ever is 65.5%, which is in the year 2000. Lowest ever was 58.1% sometime in the 1950s. Wonder why that was, because people didn't, not everyone worked back in those days. Any
Yeah,
last minute thoughts?
no, I mean, I think and I know a lot of people's eyes probably glaze over and talk to the numbers, but the devil's in the details with those. And I do think that's going to be important to see where, it's for people in a lot of areas, it feels bad. Like there's a lot of talk, are we in a recession? Are we not in a recession? And the numbers by the pure form, we're not, right? We actually, the GDP grew like pretty significantly, but I think, some of it is, propped up by some unsustainable things. But at the same time, like the unemployment rate is low. Like there's not a lot of people looking for work. And so, I do see things, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that causes companies to kind of push back or kind of push out hiring or kind of projects or initiatives. But I think that'll start to ease. And I think everybody talks about interest rates, but that's going to be a factor. I think as those start to drop a bit, I think it will just kind of loosen things up a bit. And I think some of the companies that are struggling with some sort of things being determined there and kind of the things playing out, I think that'll start to open things up. And that's why I think things will kind of get better as the year goes on.
All right. We'll call it a wrap for this quarter. Thanks again for everyone for tuning in the Talent Insights podcast, part of the Talent Insights series, which is always available for replay on Talent Insights on hirewell.com, as well as YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon. Matt, great seeing you as always. Thanks again for everyone out there for tuning in. We will see you soon.